Come on. And we moving on. That's it, baby.
Pero estos dos que viven contigo.
I know you're on a roll.
Craig Spencer es el director de salud global en medicina de emergencia en el Centro Médico de la Universidad de Nueva York Presbyterian Columbia. Pero se dedica también, es un médico que se dedica y ha dedicado buena parte de su vida profesional a la salud pública. Ha trabajado como voluntario en África. Y bueno, pues se ha hecho muy conocido y reconocido por varios temas. Uno de ellos es que es sobreviviente del ébola, la epidemia que pegó en Guinea. Él estaba ahí como voluntario. Y también por un video que se ha hecho viral, que nosotros vamos a compartir con ustedes, en donde de manera muy gráfica y muy puntual y detallada también, comparte el día a día de los médicos, del personal de salud que está en la primera línea de batalla frente a esta pandemia ahora del COVID-19. Y yo hago contacto con él porque, pues, la verdad es que ha hecho este video y ha despertado en todos nosotros este sentimiento de agradecimiento, pero también de respeto y de mucha admiración por todos estos trabajadores. Dr. Craig Spencer, thank you so much for your time. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks for having me.
How are you?
I'm doing okay. About to go into work. Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, about to go into work. Just had a nice run. Trying to find some time for myself and for my family. Things have gotten a little bit better here, so we're all taking a breath and trying to think and prepare for what comes next.
You're in New York, where the epicenter of the pandemic in the United States happened. So you were saying you're a little bit better.
Yeah. Compared to where we were 5 or 6 weeks ago, when walking into the emergency room was honestly felt like the apocalypse. Now we have fewer case numbers. We have, at least from a COVID perspective, we're doing a lot better. We have fewer patients that are coming in sick, fewer patients that are needing respirators, mechanical ventilation. We still have some, but the number is not anything close to what it was even a few weeks ago, and definitely not what it was, a month or a month and a half ago.
I was just saying to people that you share a video with such a graphic and detailed way of how things are like in the front lines during this time. What motivated you to do and to share this video, Craig?
It's interesting because it was based on something that I wrote at the end of March, and it was really based on something that I saw just a few days before that, right when COVID was starting to overtake our emergency departments. I remember being at work one day and feeling like I felt back in West Africa, which I know you talked about. Having that same feeling of being in personal protective equipment all day, having that feeling of being in fear every day that you went to work, every patient that you saw. Is this the person that might infect me? How do I do this, and how do I do this well? And I thought of that so much, and I realized for me it felt kind of normal. I've done that before. But for all of my colleagues, it was really scary and it was really new. And I started thinking about how I can share that with the rest of the world. We knew that cameras would not be allowed in the hospital for a lot of reasons. Also because it just it didn't seem like a smart thing to have people see and watch that suffering. Yeah. And it wasn't safe by any means. So I figured the only way that I could do that is I could share that by writing something. And I wrote something on Twitter, I think, that was well received and shared by President Obama and seen by, I think, 21 million people. And I didn't realize that it would resonate so much. It was something that I wrote for me and for my friends and for my colleagues. And after I wrote those words, someone had reached out, Al Jazeera Plus, AG Plus, to talk about maybe putting together a video. So they used those words and some words that I put together a few weeks after, kind of right when we were in the middle of the worst, to put together this video, with the goal being, let's share information about COVID. Let's tell people exactly how bad it is, our experiences, because people maybe heard of them Maybe they heard of them from me or from other people here, but they weren't able to see the reality of
Exactly. That was
showing
so,
it.
yeah, so moving and so, yeah.
Well, yeah, just, I mean, I think people expect in emergency departments that what our job is to save lives, right? That is what we're trained to do. If someone comes in with trauma or bleeding from a pregnancy or for the heart attack, our job is to save lives. And we all had to shift to thinking about how to let lives pass peacefully. This is something that we don't do. We never do. It's antithetical to our profession, but it's something we all had to learn really quickly. Otherwise, we just weren't able to provide the best high quality care to everyone. We didn't need to put everyone on a ventilator. We knew the majority of them, quite frankly, would not come off of it. So instead of rushing to do these heroic things, we slowed down. We had discussions with family to do the humane thing, which was give them some moments to talk to family, have an opportunity to connect once more, because a lot of those people never would have that opportunity again.
Exactly. That was something I wanted to talk to you about. Like, the philosophy of medicine is to save lives.
Yeah.
And now it seems like doctors are just managing pain and death every day, all the time. And that should be very painful.
For sure. Yeah. As doctors, our first goal is primum non nocere, which is first do no harm. Our job is to save lives, but it's also to save everyone's humanity, to make sure that we're able to provide people with care that is focused on them and their needs, not just what we as doctors think that they need. So we were realizing that with a lot of the patients we were seeing that were really, really sick, if we intubated them, put them on mechanical ventilation, we knew that many of them would not come off. And we knew that we needed to have those discussions with those family members, with those patients, because we knew that doing so could potentially be harmful. And we knew that many people wouldn't have that opportunity to connect ever again. So for us, it was really painful. It was painful to talk to families on phone, as everyone is awkwardly holding up an iPad or a telephone, and try to have discussions about end of life care. What are the goals? What did your grandfather really appreciate in life? Would he want to be intubated? Would he want to be in an intensive care unit? The likelihood that someone is going to die if we do that or if we don't do that. Those are hard discussions to have when people are well, sitting around a table. They're really difficult to have when someone is sick over an iPhone.
Mm-hmm. Now, you exactly in your video, you spoke about trying to console the patients, also the family members, that they never get to see each other again, Craig. I mean, and again, this is very, very painful. So my question is, does the emotional toll the patient goes through any affectation and affect their physical state?
Do you mean what our patients are seeing themselves? This inability,
like isolated, yeah, absolutely isolated, without seeing the family again, never again.
Yeah, well, I can speak to that as someone who was a patient myself, who was isolated, who didn't have human contact other than people in gloves and personal protective equipment for 19 days. It is very isolating. You want to think that you're not toxic, but that whole time you feel toxic. You feel like, one, you have a high chance of dying, but also you have a high chance of infecting the people that are caring for you, and they won't know for days or for weeks. It's impossible to not have that added personal strain of feeling like you're putting more burden on family because you can't, make these decisions, or because you're unwell, or because you might infect the caregivers that are taking care of you. And that must undoubtedly add to the physical strain that virus is having on everyone's bodies, especially in their last minutes or in the last hours of life. That mental toll added to that physical toll is certainly additive and can't be helpful.
I suppose, and after watching your video, you should be exhausted. You and your colleagues and everybody who's working on the front line. Yeah. Physically and emotionally too. How do you cope with it? How do you manage?
I think everyone is doing a little bit differently. Look, in some sense, we're lucky that this was only for a couple months. When I worked in West Africa during Ebola, I worked alongside doctors from Guinea, nurses from Guinea, who had to deal with that for years. And we had to deal with this for 2 months. That's not to undermine or undervalue how horrible and difficult it was. The burden was huge and horrible every day. I saw the physical toll on my colleagues, how they got really tired and exhausted. We're now starting to see a lot of that mental toll. We are exhausted. Everyone is exhausted. We're starting to see that play out a little bit more. Unfortunately, you know, we saw a lot of our colleagues get sick during this. I wrote a piece just recently in the Washington Post talking about the mental health problems that we've seen, you know, watching our colleagues come in struggling to breathe, our friends, and trying to care for them, watching our nurses that we've worked with for me for 9 years that died after struggling with COVID on a ventilator. And then one of my personal colleagues and one of my friends who survived COVID and after died by suicide. The toll has been horrible and drastic everywhere in New York City and the places where we've been seeing COVID cases. Now that the wave of cases is starting to recede, I think we're starting to see that damage, unfortunately, a lot more.
Yeah, I read that you wrote, and it's terrible, terrible. Do you get any emotional support of the workers? I mean,
yeah, the hospital, everyone has been really supportive. Our colleagues have created groups. Everyone has done everything they can to reach out, to have a buddy system, to make sure there's someone that's available for you. I always said to my colleagues, I am happy to be available at any point, whether you need to call and talk or whether you need to call and cry. It was really important for us early on to have someone that you could be vulnerable with, because otherwise in medicine, we're meant to act like we know everything and to be confident and to be brave and to put up with long hours. That's what we do. But underneath that all, you can't see what we saw and do what we did and continue to remain unscathed, unmoved. That's just not possible. And
it's not possible.
It's not human. Yeah. So we've, as a department, as a group, as providers, as colleagues, we've all set up systems that have provided or tried to provide that support. But again, this for all of us, this is quite novel. We don't know who the most vulnerable people are. Is it the people that are speaking out the most or the people that are speaking out the least? We don't know. All of us saw really horrible things that in a sense, so much of it has been normalized when none of it, of course, is.
Now, yeah, as you said, you were a volunteer 2014 and actually in Africa, and actually you're a survivor from Ebola. What would you say is the difference between these two contingencies?
I talk about it a lot because they are very, very different, but they're also really, really similar. In the ways that they're different, of course, Ebola is much more deadly. If you get Ebola, the likelihood that you'll die is somewhere between 60.
It's very nasty.
It's very nasty. It's very quick. 60 to 90%, even with treatment. Thankfully, now we have treatment. Thankfully, now we have vaccines to reduce those numbers. But it's still nothing that anyone wants to have, I promise you. COVID, of course, is not the same. It primarily impacts older people that have chronic health conditions. That doesn't mean it can't kill 30-year-olds or 40-year-olds. I saw it do that many times. But the death rate, and the likelihood that you'll die from it is, of course, much smaller compared to Ebola. What I think is so interesting about the similarities is the way that we talked about them. Here in the United States in 2014 and 2015, we looked down on West Africans because they couldn't stay at home, or they wouldn't comply with the quarantine, or they couldn't stop doing these socio-cultural practices like funerals that were leading to an increase in cases. And then a month ago, you see people here in my home state of Michigan storming the governor's mansion with guns because they want to be let out of lockdown. They want to exercise their constitutional rights. They want the lockdown
to be over. Yeah.
I mean, the similarities between what happened in the State House in Michigan and what happened in Monrovia in Liberia with people basically breaking out was in many respects the exact same, but the way that we talked about them was completely different. And I think that unfortunately has been a painful and an everlasting side effect of this.
Now, when you got sick, Craig, sick and you knew what could happen with you, I mean, you were attending patients with Ebola. I suppose you were very frightened, very scared that what could happen with you. I mean, you were the first patient with Ebola in New York, right?
Right. Yep. Yeah, of course. I mean, it's something that I thought about, but I kept thinking back on the patients that I took care of in West Africa who had access to nothing like what I had here in New York City. The hospital where I was treated here in New York had more doctors on staff in that one hospital than all 3 countries that were impacted by Ebola, Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone combined. So I knew that whereas there were 30 people taking care of me at any one time when I was being treated for Ebola, I was taking care of 30 people at any one time in West Africa. There was this horrible and really sad inequality between access to resources. And we saw that play out in the number of people dying. We saw the impact of that. We spent more money in the United States building Ebola response centers at hospitals, even in New York, than we did in 2014 responding to Ebola on behalf of Doctors Without Borders, despite the fact that there were very few cases in the US and tens of thousands of cases in West Africa. Yeah. So this horrible inequality between access to resources, to caring started there in West Africa, has really started before that, but I think was magnified there. And unfortunately, we're continuing to see that with COVID now, how it's disproportionately impacted people of color in the United States, Black communities, brown communities, people that have had to continue to go to work despite lockdowns, despite stay-at-home orders, because otherwise they don't have access to the same resources that people like myself do, quite frankly.
The same thing happens in our country, in my country, in Mexico. I mean, people need to go out and work and in order to eat that day.
Of course.
Now that you mentioned
same thing in my country.
Yeah. About racism and discrimination, to the riots right now. I mean, that's the focus again. It's New York again. So you should be afraid that these riots and the disturbances could aggravate the situation, the COVID situation also.
Yeah, it's something
now that you're a little bit better, doing a little bit better.
Yeah, and it's not even just in New York. I mean, there were 40, Los Angeles, 40 cities that had curfew orders in place because of protests. I mean, I think there's a couple things. One, everyone will argue, and especially public health experts will agree, that racism has been a public health crisis in the United States since long before COVID. It was amplified by COVID. So here in New York City, the likelihood of people dying if they were Black or brown, if they were Hispanic, Latino, or African American, was twice as high than it was for white people like myself or for Asian New Yorkers. More than twice as high, which is crazy. These are inequities that have been built into my country for hundreds of years since its founding. We've seen them in terms of incarceration, the public health impact that it's had. And right now what we're seeing is this bubbling up of anger and frustration, not caused by COVID, but amplified by COVID, by the recognition that communities of color in the United States have been disproportionately impacted by this and other public health crises since the beginning of our country. And I think, quite frankly, people have had enough. The majority of the protests have been, thankfully, been peaceful. That doesn't mean that there hasn't been some non-peaceful protestation. I think that for me as a public health professional, what I think of is, what impact is this going to have, especially on COVID, because we're still in the middle of that crisis, even if that's not the focus of all of the news right now. We all suspect that having hundreds or thousands of people in close proximity, many of them, yelling and screaming or, getting shot by tear gas, this is going to increase the case numbers. But I think what everyone agrees is that, there was no other way to make the change that needs to be made in this country for those communities to have a voice.
It's about time, right? It's about time.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's happened so many times. As someone that grew up in Detroit, which itself is a racially divided city, having seen and experienced that my whole life, and now working here again in a big city that is racially divided, and working internationally in public health, and seeing the impact that traditional colonial mentalities have had in places like East Africa, West Africa, Southeast Asia. It's no surprise that people have had enough. They're frustrated, they're angry, and it's about time.
As a survivor, Greg, of such a terrible illness like Ebola, do you think this experience somehow give you a particular advantage as how to manage this situation, like professionally, but personal también, also?
Yeah, I think for both of those, it really helped. Professionally, the way that you manage infectious disease, communicable disease breakouts, especially ones that are really scary, is quite similar. You have to have certain protocols in place. You have to keep your staff protected. You need to use certain equipment. I've done that all a lot. I know how to set up an emergency department so that we minimize the risk of infection to providers, but also to patients. So professionally, certainly having that experience was very helpful. For me personally, it was also very helpful because I have been through this before. I've dealt with very scary diseases that I knew could infect me and could possibly kill me. I think having that experience emboldens you a little bit and makes you realize you need to take certain precautions, but you also need to watch out for your friends and for your buddies and for your colleagues. For me, it was helpful having that experience. It taught me a lot that kept me safe during this, but also helped me keep my colleagues and my friends safe.
But you didn't have a children then, back then, right?
Yes.
And that should change everything. All your mind frame.
It does, yeah. I mean, I have an 18-month-old daughter now. And in addition to thinking about that constantly, you know, of course, when I come home, taking my clothes off, showering before I see her, it also adds a lot to do at home. A lot, you know, my wife has a full-time, really important job. And so we try to share childcare duties at home. It is really, really tough, in addition to writing and educating and doing media so that people understand and making videos and going to work in a hospital. It's a lot of work, as a lot of people are finding. Raising kids, just like teaching kids, is a lot of work.
That's a 24-hour job, yeah.
Yeah. But you're right, it does make you think a little bit different about the risks. I think for me, my kind of personal compass says that I have a moral imperative to respond in situations in which I have the skills to do so. So can I help in a certain place? Do I have the skills to do so? And do they need them? Yes, then that's something that I need to think about and perhaps put myself on the line for, because as a global crisis, in the middle of a global crisis, we need global solidarity. Right now, cases are increasing in places like Central and South America. We see what's happening in Brazil, cases increasing in Mexico, in many other places. As the United States maybe plateaus, we may feel like, okay, great, we're doing a little bit better. But if this virus exists anywhere in the world, it will be a continued risk to all of us. And without global solidarity, we're going to be in big trouble, whether it's the US, whether it's Mexico, whether it's Brazil, whether it's Russia. We need to fight this together. We cannot do it separately because we will not win that way.
What took you to West Africa back then as a volunteer?
Yeah. This recognition that I could add something, that there was a need for people that were, one, willing to do it, but two, had the skills to do it. And I was lucky to have trained as a doctor, to have trained as a public health professional, and to have been willing to work in a place that many other people wouldn't. I'd studied French in high school, so I was able to go to Guinea, where there was, you know, a certain need. And really, I think at my core, there was just this personal demand to give back, to do something, recognizing that people in Guinea deserve access to healthcare, just like people in Greenwich Village here in New York City.
Is that something you would like to do again, Craig?
Absolutely, yeah, for sure. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, you know, if COVID didn't happen in New York City, if it happened in New Mexico, I would have been just as happy.
You would be there?
I'd be happy to go there as well, for sure.
Now, we know that all the scientific community in all the world is working desperately to find a cure and a vaccine. Mm-hmm. In realistic terms, Craig, mm-hmm. do you think the end of this pandemic will come soon?
I guess it depends on what you mean by soon. Will it come in 2020? No. Will it come in 2021? No. I think this is something that we're going to be dealing with for some time. It's definitely going to be months, and it'll probably be years. Now, it might be different, right?
Explain
maybe
different. Explain
Sure.
different. Elaborate.
Yeah. Hopefully, no one else has the experience that we had in New York City. Hopefully, no one else has to see so many people dying every single day. If we're able to control the number of people that get infected, we can control the number of people that have the horrible consequences of this disease. That means things like finding safe ways to exist together, staying home when possible, wearing a mask. Those are the things that we know really work right now, in addition to testing, isolating, doing contact tracing, things that I call bread and butter, basic public health tools. Now, do we need a vaccine or something else to get us back to some sense of normal, to get us back to sporting matches, etc.? Probably. We're going to need something that provides enough protection for enough of society so that this virus cannot run rampant. And a vaccine will likely happen. I think the first question many people had is it even possible to make a vaccine? We think that there likely is now. There's been some prospects, some promising candidates that have come out. But it's going to take a long time to know whether they're effective. It's going to take an even longer time to make them in a quantity high enough so that everyone can get them, or that the majority of people can get them. Think about the fact that there are over 7 billion people on Earth.
Exactly.
Who are we going to vaccinate
again, the poor
first?
Countries and the poor countries again. Yeah,
and we'll see right now what happens. The wealthiest countries get the wealthiest medications. They spend the most on healthcare. So does that mean that I or someone in New York City deserves a vaccine before someone in Ecuador? What if we have no cases here and there's a big outbreak in Ecuador? Is the US going to be willing, if we make these, to send them there? I think history has probably told us, no, that's not going to happen. So how do we not only create a vaccine and scale it up, and then think about who we give it to primarily once we have the first 100 million doses? That's going to be difficult, and that's going to be tough, especially when you have, from a US perspective, the United States pulling out of all of these multilateral organizations like the World Health Organization, losing access to a lot of that really important knowledge sharing that happens. What is the impact of that going to be once we have a vaccine, once we have therapeutics? I don't think anybody knows. But to answer your question, I think we are not at the end of this. We are likely still very much at the beginning of this, even 6 months into COVID.
What is your personal opinion about using masks? Because it's been very controversial.
It has been, although what we're learning more and more is that they're absolutely helpful. One, at the beginning of this, we saw images of people primarily in Asia, and especially in China, everyone wearing a mask. For a long time, people have worn masks. It's more built into the culture. In the United States, people don't wear masks, right? We have this independent streak where we're going to do what we want to do, as opposed to in places like China where people say, we're going to do what's best for the society. I'm pretty surprised at how quickly most people, especially here in New York City, adapted and changed their willingness to wear masks. Now most people, almost all people, are wearing masks in New York. We know that they do decrease the amount of transmission. So if I'm sick and I'm wearing a mask and I cough or I'm breathing, it's going to decrease the amount of virus that gets out. It's not perfect, but it will help. We also know that if you're wearing a mask, it will provide some protection. Again, it's not perfect, but it does help. We're going to need every little bit of help if we're going to try to decrease the number of cases, decrease the number of people in emergency rooms, and decrease the number of people that are dying. So I'm very supportive of using them, especially once we get to winter season as well, right? When we have influenza, other coronavirus, other respiratory illnesses that can help us decrease the burden of these respiratory viruses.
Was the world taken by surprise by COVID?
Yes, but I don't think we necessarily need it to be. Right? Like many people in the United States and all over the world have been saying, there's a pandemic coming. There's a pandemic coming. We need to be prepared. We've torn apart the pandemic preparedness architecture here in the United States. We learned a lot in West Africa. The United States built up a pandemic playbook so that we were able to respond. We started funding activities all over the world to find where these viruses are coming from and think about how to react. But a lot of that has been torn apart, quite frankly, under this administration. Leadership at the higher levels in the White House has been put aside. We got rid of a biosecurity directorate, someone that would basically run a pandemic response. We've underfunded our public health departments, the Centers for Disease Control as well. I think we have undermined all of our capacity and ability to respond to a pandemic before this pandemic hit, so that once it did hit, we were caught off guard, we were flat-footed, and that showed with our really, quite frankly, delayed and imperfect response. We shouldn't have been taken off guard, but we were.
Now, tell me something. Does the amount of virus in your body make a difference to the severity of the infection? I mean, taking into consideration the amount of doctors that have been infected, because, I mean, you're the ones that are all the time with the patients.
Yes. So we know that, well, there's a lot of things we don't know about coronavirus. So we're not 100% sure about a lot of things. There's more that we don't know than we do know. But we do know that you need to get infected with the virus, likely on a mucous membrane, primarily in your mouth or in your nose. And it's likely that the more virus that you get at the beginning, the more likely you are to be infected, the more likely you are to have a more severe infection. This is similar to other viral infections. We don't know exactly how much virus you need and how much of a difference it makes in the severity. But once you have more virus, you're certainly going to be more infectious and get sicker quicker.
I see. What about immunity? Because you're right. It's much more what we don't know about COVID than what we know. But what about immunity?
What we know about immunity right now is that we suspect once you've been infected and survived, you will make antibodies. And with those antibodies, it will prevent you from being infected again. Now, we don't know if that's true for everyone, and we don't know how long that immunity will last, but the likelihood is that you will have some immunity in both the short term and maybe even the longer term, maybe 1, 2, maybe even 3 years or beyond. But again, we don't know yet because this virus has only been with us for the past 6 months.
I imagine, Craig, every experience you face in the hospital right now that you've been facing, you and your colleagues, it's much more terrifying than the next. Mm-hmm. But what's the worst that you've seen?
I mean, through this pandemic or just in general?
Through this pandemic, yeah.
I mean, I think the worst has been just seeing patient after patient after patient come in unable to breathe, realizing that we have no other option for them other than putting them on life support or withdrawing treatment, and doing that every single day, hour after hour, every single day, doing it in really uncomfortable personal protective equipment, being tired, not having time to take off your goggles to drink. That's been the hardest part, and I don't think any of us are going to forget that.
On the other side, what gives you hope to keep going every day?
What gives me hope is that every day my colleagues showed up despite the risks themselves, despite the possibility that they would be infected, despite the really sad and horrible things we saw every day. My colleagues happily showed up on the front lines, took care of patients, provided the highest level of care with this focus on compassion and on humanity. And I saw it every single day. That's what gave me hope, to know that at our core, medical providers, not just in New York City, but really all over the world, care about their patients, care and want to make sure that they get what they need, the compassion, the high quality care if they can provide it. And it was beautiful seeing our profession broken down in a sense to its core capabilities and really what our core mission was. That was what we're supposed to do. And I think my colleagues here and really all over have done that really well.
Finally, Craig, what can we learn as a society to ensure our safety?
What we can learn as a society is that we are only as strong as the weakest amongst us. We've seen that here in New York, where communities of color have been disproportionately impacted by this. We've seen this globally as it's had an impact in societies where leadership has been not really trusting of public health, in illiberal and in more autocratic places where leadership, primarily older white men, think that they know better than time-honored public health principles. I think what we can learn from this is that public health works in keeping people safe, and people all over the world generally need the exact same things from our public health professionals and providers, which is a focus on preventing disease outbreaks, responding to them quickly when we need to, and making sure it's not just local, but it's global. Because as I said before, we are only as safe and as strong as our weakest link. And right now, there are so many weak links, not just here in the United States, but all around the world, that are still susceptible to COVID, that will still have outbreaks of COVID, both now and for this foreseeable future.
Dr. Craig Spencer, thank you so, so much for your time and for everything you've done. Thank you very much. And keep safe.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Likewise.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye. Bye.